that is based on a new method, which is pegged primarily on needs assessment together with the cost of the program. They arrived at this through what they called the means testing instrument, or what most Kenyans know as the MTI. Our presenters today will share greater detail on what that method involves, but basically, in summary, it's a scientific sort of method that used various proxy indicators to determine the level of need for each student. So that method has been applied in determining what amount of financing should be availed to each student seeking that kind of support from government. And it's through scholarships and loans, as well as private financing. So there are the different elements that our presenters will provide greater detail on. But the reason why we thought it's useful to have this discussion and why the IEA carried out an assessment in the first place to check for adequacy and equity concerns. Obviously, we've all had the concerns around the public discourse around the concerns whether the financial assistance that has been provided actually meets equity principles, whether it reaches the most vulnerable students, whether the loan amounts are sufficient to meet the rising costs of education. And our presenters today will basically tell us from IEA's assessment what our findings are. So we hope to be able to provide you with the evidence on what the data shows us. So we hope that this discussion will be useful to help us reframe the arising policy questions around financing higher education, to sort of clarify any misconceptions based on what the data tells us. So if there have been any public misconceptions, we will see from the data. And we'd also like to hear your thoughts on what you think about this new model. Many of us here have been beneficiaries of the facility provided for financing higher education in the past, and so we can appreciate the significance it has in facilitating access to higher education. So for that reason, we can also appreciate why that if the funding model does not work both equitably and adequately, then we risk widening the gap between those who can access education and those who cannot. So that is the premise of our discussion today, the background. We will go now to the actual presentation. So we have 5 speakers today, and the presentation will be as follows. So to begin with, we'll have the first part, which will be on the methodology for IEA's assessment of the study, which will be done by Winnie Ogejo, who is a program officer in the Futures program. Then we will have presentation on some of the findings, which will be done by my colleagues Vivian and Chantal, who are our research assistants. And then we'll have presentation on the findings on equity, which will be done by my colleague Jairus, who also works in the Futures program. Then the last part of this presentation will be on the conclusions to summarize the entire discussion, and it will be made by Kwame, who is the CEO of IEA. So with that, I think I can now just go directly to inviting our first speaker to share the presentation. So Winnie, you're welcome.
All right, thank you so much, Jackie, for the introduction and for bringing us on board to have this conversation this morning. And thank you everyone for making time to be part of this very, very important conversation that has been going on, as Jackie has mentioned. So very quickly, I will take us through our outline is as such. So we will be speaking to the objective of today's webinar. And then, of course, we will take us through the methodology on how we arrived at our findings. And then we will now unpack to you our findings. So in terms of our objectives, we because we've mentioned that we are assessing the new funding model that is being applied by the Higher Education Loans Board. And we are looking at it in relation to its implication for adequacy and equity. So our analysis was responding to questions of adequacy and questions of equity. So when responding to the questions of adequacy, we were evaluating whether the funding provided by the Higher Education Loans Board meets the actual financial requirements by students. And then when responding to the equity question, we were we were examining how equitable the funding is distributed amongst students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so when we move to our methodology, because we have mentioned that our analysis is split into two parts, the adequacy question and the equity question, we had methodologies. We used different methodologies for the two different key areas that we are analyzing. So for the adequacy question, we looked at the nominal terms against the real terms. So what we did for that is we adjusted the nominal values to for inflation for us to be able to get the real values. And we will be explaining that as we go forward. And then to also look at adequacy and its prioritization, we looked at the total amount disbursed for loans as a share of GDP, and we also looked at it as a share of GOK, Government of Kenya spending, and of course as a share of education spending basket, just so that we demonstrate whether or not these are actually increasing or decreasing and what that implies. And then for the equity question, we used three different methods to just understand the equity, to respond to the equity question. So first, we used the benefits incidence. We did a benefits incidence analysis. And why we conducted a benefits incidence analysis is so that we were able to measure the distribution of transfers across the students. Just how equitable was it? And if it was not equitable, then what does that mean? If it was equitable, what does that mean? And to be able to do that benefits incidence, and even for all the other methodologies, remember, as I'll be explaining as we proceed, and I'll explain this on the next slide maybe, that the Higher Education Loans Board put the students or grouped the students into bands, and then out of those bands, they allocated the funds to the students depending on which band you fell in. But for purposes of our analysis, we redistributed the total number of students, and the year we are working with is the financial year 2023-24, where the total number of students who were awarded loans was 112,281. So we redistributed these students into equal number of groups, into equal numbers into different groups. And what we did is we grouped them into 5 clusters representing the five different income quantiles, which then had equal number of students, which was 22,456. So as we will be progressing, we will slowly move from calling them bands to regrouping them into clusters, and we'll explain that as my colleagues will be speaking to the equity question. And then when we're speaking to the Lorenz curve, we use the Lorenz curve just so that we are able to have a representation of income inequality, because the Lorenz curve allows us to have a theoretical representation of income inequality. And then we also had the Gini coefficient, which allowed us to measure the inequality amongst a population. And the population we are speaking to in this case is the students. So we used it to measure the distribution of resources, the available resources amongst the students. So just for clarity, the Gini coefficient measures the degree of inequality, and the Lorenz curve allowed us to understand the distribution of the available income resources. So back to the main thing, which will form the main core of our conversation, which is the means testing instrument. What really is this means testing instrument? So the means testing instrument is a means to determine the ability or inability of a household to finance higher education. So it is what the Higher Education Loans Board used to determine how much a household can afford to pump into financing for higher education. And then we also looked at it in terms of what question does the means testing instrument answer. And the question is answered is how much a household can raise towards the higher education cost, considering their gross household income and expenses. So this is just to unpack to you, because this is the main tool that the Higher Education Loans Board is using. So then through that means testing instrument, the Higher Education Loans Board is able to group students into different bands. So they have band 1 to band 5, which is what we will be analyzing. Of course, there is the band 6, but that is not part of our analysis. Our analysis just focused on band 1 to band 5, which is a representation of students who are eligible for the funding by the Higher Education Loans Board. And then, as you can see, we have different composites, components of this fund. We have the scholarship, and we have the loans, and we have the upkeep. So just to unpack to us these components. So when we're speaking about the composite, my colleagues will come in and they'll be speaking to the composite component of the fund. This composite just speaks to the total amount of loans distributed or disbursed by the Higher Education Loans Board. And then this composite is split into two parts. We have the scholarship component and we have the loans component. The scholarship component is considered a transfer and is not repayable. Students are not expected to repay back the scholarship component. And then when we come to the loans component, the loans is what the students are actually expected to pay back to the Higher Education Loans Board. And so this component that they are repaying back, which is the loans, is also split into two components yet again. So we have the upkeep component and the tuition component. The upkeep component is what the student receives to manage their daily expenses. That is food, stationery, accommodation, and all those daily components that they need to take care of. And then the tuition part is what goes directly to the university. So just for clarity, and you'll need to have this at the back of your mind as we will be having the conversation on equity. So very quickly now we proceed to our findings. And remember, we had mentioned that our findings are split into two. We are responding to the adequacy question, and we are also responding to the equity question. So the first part of our findings will be findings on the adequacy question. And in responding to the adequacy question, we are looking at it on two sides as well. Of course, remember, there's the demand side and there's the supply side. The demand side will speak to the students and the average amount that is available per student. And then the supply side will speak to how much money is available to help to disburse to students as loans. So in speaking to the first part, which is our supply side, this is now the help side, we wanted we analyzed to understand what the trends show us as far as the as far as the government, as a share of GDP, as a share of government spending, and as a share of education spending. And what Table 1 demonstrates to us is that in nominal terms, the amount that Higher Education Loans Board has been disbursing to students has been increasing. And you notice that in 2014-15, at the bottom of the table, HELB distributed just about 5 billion Kenya shillings. And in 2023-24, they have distributed a total of 34 billion. So that tells you that the supply side has been increasing. The big question is that we will be asking ourselves at the end of this presentation is it increasing at the same pace as the demand side, if at all the demand side is increasing, and we'll be looking at that. And then if you look at the loans awarded as a share of GDP, government spending, and education spending, it is very clear that that has also been increasing, because you notice as a share of GDP in 2014-15, it was at 0.09%. And in 2023-2024, the loans awarded as a share of GDP has increased to 0.21%. So there's definitely an increase. And the same speaks to the loans as a share of GOK spending. So let us assume that the government of Kenya is spending 100 shillings, 100 shillings. So what we are saying is in 2014-15, for every 100 shillings that the government spent, 31 cents was actually spent on loans for higher education. If you look at that trajectory and we analyze it in 2023-24, it goes without saying, given the data shown on table 20 on table 1, that has also been increasing, because in 2023-24, for every 100 shillings that the government has spent, 87 cents has actually been spent on loans for higher education. So this, and if you look at as a share of spending, of education spending, so this speaks to the education basket. You also notice that it has actually increased almost 3 times, from 1.87% in 2014-15 to 5.09 in 2023-24. So this goes to speak that in terms of priority of funding higher education, definitely that prioritization is on the rise. The question we will be asking ourselves is, as much as that prioritization is rising, is it meeting the demand that we will be speaking to? Then table 2 is just a graphical representation of the data in table 1. So you can notice that the gray line, which is education spending, of course, has the highest rising. And then we also have the GOK, which is the orange line, which has also, we have mentioned, has also been increasing. And of course, as a share of GDP, that has also been on the rise. So this is just a representation for us to answer the question as a priority. Are we increasing it as a priority, or is there a challenge? And the data shows us that indeed we are prioritizing. The government is prioritizing. Then we went to answer, still on the supply side, we wanted to understand how much in nominal terms and how much in real terms the government is spending. It's given. We wanted to understand. So this chart, this table responds to the maintaining the buying power. So for us to understand whether or not we are maintaining the buying power, we constructed a deflator. And in constructing the deflator, we used the CPI, and the CPI is just an annual measurement of inflation. And for us to be able to know by what amount the price has changed, we are using the CPI plus 1. Then we proceeded to construct the deflator. And in constructing the deflator, we are using 100 shillings in 2014-15. And we are asking ourselves, what is the buying power? Or for you to be able to maintain that buying power of 100 shillings that was in 2014-15, how much do you need to be spending in 2023-2024? And the answer to that is, for you to be able to maintain that buying power in 2023-2024, you should be spending 176,000 Kenya shillings. So if you're maintaining that buying power, 100 shillings in 2014-15 is equivalent to 176 shillings in 2023-2024. What does this deflator do? The deflator allows us to index and calculate the change in buying power over a period of time. And in doing that, what we are taking into account is inflation and time. And the time we are speaking about in this case is a period of 10 years. And then we are also using inflation, but the inflation we are using is to see the compounding effect of inflation. So that that 100, when you compound the effect of inflation, then you get the 176 shillings. Then if you look at the total annual loans disbursed in 2015, in 20 the real value of 33 billion in 2014, 2015 money. If you calculate, given the explanation I've given prior, then the real value of the 33 billion would actually be the 19,000 at the bottom. So what we are saying is, if you wanted to calculate and get the buying, the real value of the 5 billion at the top, which is in 2014-15. Remember, 2014-15 is our base year. Then you will have to calculate and multiply that 5 billion by the 146, which we constructed through our deflator, and you will get roughly 8 billion. So that means that if you are to spend an equivalent of 5 billion that was spent in 2014-15 in 2023-24, then you should be spending just about 8 billion. So this is just for us. We're answering the question of, are we maintaining the buying power or of 2014-15, or are we not maintaining it? So that answers that. And then let us now speak to the demand side. We have just explained to you the supply side, and we are answering the question of how much help is redistributing to students in total. And now we want to speak to, we are now speaking to, on the demand side, on average, how much is a student receiving, and what is inflation doing to the average size of the grant or the fund to the students. So if you look at the number of successful applicants, it goes without saying that the demand for education has been increasing, because in our base year of 2014-15, HELP funded just about 137,800 students. But in 2023-24, they are funding 605,080 students. So that shows you clearly that the demand for education is increasing. And then if you look at the average loans in real value, that is also, it's actually falling, because, and the real value, this is if you factor in for inflation and time. As explained in the previous, you construct a deflator. So if you look at that, in 2014-15, the average amount that was awarded per student is 36,531. But in 2023-2024, in real terms, HELP is awarding 912 shillings. So in real terms, what we are saying, that the real value of the average loan awarded to students is actually falling. And then if you look at the real average loans per student, what we are saying is, for you to be able to fund at the rate and match the buying power of 2014-15. HELP should currently be funding at 64,141 shillings per student on average. But what they're actually funding is just about 56,000. So there is a financing gap of about 8,000 shillings per student. So because what we are saying is, for them to be matching the buying power of 2014-15, which is 36,531, they should be funding at 64,141. But what are they giving? They are funding at 56,000 thereabout, a gap of just about 8,000. So what we are trying to demonstrate is, as much as both the demand and the supply side has grown, you notice that the demand side is growing faster, and the supply side is trying to meet. And what that means is, with the demand side growing faster than the supply side has to reduce the funding to each student so that they meet the growing demand for students. In terms of looking at it as a share of GDP, as a share of GOK spending and as a share of education spending, you still notice that there's still the question of, is there a priority? And then so this the adequacy question that I was speaking to now is presented here, where I was explaining that the matching for us, what time and inflation has done to the average size of the fund, and what it has also done to the buying power being maintained. So it is very clear that HELB is trying to maintain that buying power, but there's still a difference of 8,000, as you can see on the variance section. So in 2022, 2023, of course, there's a variance of 15 billion, 15,000 per student, but that has reduced to 8,000. And of course, that it is explained by the growing number in the demand side of the equation, which has to be met by the supply side. So this just helps us to unpack that. And of course, chart 4 just is a graphical representation of what is happening with the data on table 4. So that is what our findings for the supply side and demand side, responding to the question of inadequacy, tells us. So my colleagues will come in and just take us through what the equity question looks like as far as our equity question is concerned. Jackie, thank you.
Thanks, Winnie. Yeah, we can go straight to Vivian.
Okay, thank you very much, Winnie, for that elaborate explanation on the adequacy side. So I'm Vivian. I'll take you through the part 2, which responds to the question on equity. Now, from the table we have table 5. What I'm going to explain is the first part of this component, which is the composite allocation. The composite allocation here, I mean the total spending, which includes scholarship, loans, the loans are upkeep and tuition loans. Then table 5, sorry, that we're seeing, table 5 shows the summary of benefit incidence of the composite allocation by the income quintiles. Just as Winnie have said, benefit incidence basically means it is a technique that is used to evaluate how public spending is distributed and who benefits from it. Now, what we did is this, to come up with the income quintiles. It is totally different from the bands that the HELB showed us. It is the quintiles. What we did, we divided the students into 5 equal income groups. The total number of students were 112,000. We divided them into 5 equal income groups. That comes to a total of 22,455 in each income quintiles, from the highest income, from the lowest income quintiles in quintile 1 to the highest income group in quintile 5. Then we have the cumulative composite share. That basically summarizes, or it shows the benefits appropriated by each income group in respect to the composite of the scholarship and the loans. Then we have the line of equality in the third column. This basically shows the theoretical expectation of the Lorenz curve, where each income group receives the benefit that is consistent with its population share. Now, this table is represented in chart 5, next to it on the right. So we are able to see from the chart, we have the y-axis represent the cumulative spend share and the x-axis represent the income quintile. So you'll be able to understand what the blue line means and what the orange line means. Now, just as I've said, in this simulation, what we did, we divided the income groups into 5 equal clusters or income quintiles. Then The Lorenz curve, which is the blue line, shows the degree of equality of the means testing instrument measured against the line of equality, which is the orange line. Remember, the line of equality is just a theoretical line. Then the data that we used here is both the scholarship, the tuition, and upkeep loans. Now, from the chart, we are able to see that the blue line, which is the Lorenz curve, it lies above the line of equality. That shows that the program has taken a progressive approach due to the slight inequality favoring students from lower income households. Now, let us see how we are going to illustrate this. When we go back to our table, we are able to notice now, one thing we need to know is that when this income is perfectly distributed, each quintile should receive 20% share of the university funds. But that is not the case, because when we look at our table, the second column, we are able to identify that the first two quintiles, that is quintile 1 and 2, they are receiving 45%, which is 5% higher, 5% point higher than their population share. In real sense, or uh, in equal share, they were supposed to receive 40%, but they are receiving 45%, which is 5% higher than their population share. Then when you look at quintiles 1, 2, and 3, they're receiving 64%, which is 4% higher than their population share. Then when we come to the last quintiles, that is quintile 4 and 5, the quintiles representing students from higher income households. For them, they're receiving a cumulative share of 36%, which is 4% below their population share. So we are realizing that the student in the upper quintiles who represent students from lower income group are receiving a portion that is higher than their population share, whereas the students from the higher income households, which are represented by the quintiles 4 and 5, they're receiving a share that is less than their population share. So by this, we are able to conclude basically that the benefits of this funding model is distributed towards the lower income groups or income quintiles. Yeah, thank you. So I'll welcome my next colleague to help us. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. We go to Chantal.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivian, for that great analysis of the composite distribution. My name is Chantal, and I shall be Chantal Adol, and I shall be taking you through the scholarship aspect of the new funding model. The scholarship is one component of the new funding model that makes up 48.4% of the total higher education funding for the 2023-2024 academic year. It is non-repayable, so when you think about it, we can refer to it as a stipend or a money transfer. To reiterate what my colleague earlier mentioned, we sorted the students equally within 5 clusters, ranging from the lowest income groups to the highest income groups. We call these clusters income quintiles. Each quintile has an equal population of 22,456 students. We did this to ensure an effective analysis of the benefit distribution of the scholarship amongst the students. These income quintiles are not to be confused with the original band allocations given by HELB, because the bands did not have equal population share of the students. When it comes to the distribution of the fund, the scholarships were distributed progressively, with the lower income quintiles receiving more in scholarship than in loans in comparison to the higher income quintiles. The model is constructed to ensure that 70 to 30% of the funding a student receives is scholarship, dependent on the student's household income. We saw this in slide number 6, where income in band 1 received 70% as scholarships, and each band received 10% less, with band 5 receiving 30% of the scholarships. If I could bring your attention to table 6, we see 3 separate columns: the income quintiles, cumulative scholarship share, and the line of equality. The line of equality shows us this theoretical ideal situation in which each quintile receives 20% of the scholarship funding. The cumulative scholarship share shows the scholarship benefits appropriated by each income quintile. Still on table 6, we see that income quintiles 1 and 2 receive 50% of the total scholarship, which is 10 percentage points higher than their population share. Income quintile 5 receives 15% of their total scholarship, which shows that they're receiving 5% less than their population share. In chart 6 is a graphical representation of the data that is visible in table number 6, where we see in chart 6, we're able to see the Lorenz curve in blue measured against the line of equality in orange. Just to reiterate that the line of equality is theoretical. The Lorenz curve appears above the line of equality, which implies that the scholarship is redistributed to low-income students from the higher income household students. The line of equality is therefore, the scholarship is reflecting a progressive approach to the distribution of scholarships under the new funding model. The benefit of the scholarship component of the new funding model lies with the lower income students, as they receive a disproportionate share of the scholarship relative to their population in comparison to the higher income students. Keeping in mind that scholarships are non-refundable and that the new funding model is driving the scholarship benefits towards the lower income quintiles, we are easing the repayment liability on the lower income quintiles because they will have less loans to repay in comparison to the students from the higher income quintiles. On the other hand, the funds are being redistributed from the Kenyan tax-paying population to students who are relatively wealthier than the average Kenyan and providing them with access to premium education. This raises concerns about the equitability of the distribution, as it may benefit those who are already advantaged, potentially widening the inequality gap, and concerns on the equity implications of keeping the scholarship non-repayable, as it could contribute to future income inequality resulting from unequal access to university education. Thank you so much. And now I'll pass it back to Jackie.
Thanks, Chantal. We go to Jairus.
Thanks, Jackie. Okay, my name is Jairus Kedogo, and I work under the Futures and Foresight program. I will take you through the last part of this presentation, and that's on loans. And so let's go back to our presentation. The loan component, which is administered by Higher Education Loans Board, has two components, that is tuition and upkeep. And together, they make up 52%, about 52% of the total student financing for the FY 23-24. That is under the new funding model. So remember, my colleagues have stated repeatedly that we had 112,000 students distributed in 5 different banks. But we regrouped them into 5 equal income quintals so that we have an equal number of students per quintal. And that's from quintile 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest income group and 5 being the highest income group. Ideally, in an equity where this loan is distributed equally, we would have each quintile receiving 20% of the share. But our table 7 gives us a different view or a review of how the distribution was done. So the first column, we have the quintals, and then column 2 in the middle, we have the distribution. If we had perfect equality, then we'd have the middle and the last column matching. But what we are seeing here is that students in quintal 1 received actually 16, that's 16%, 16.6% of the share of tuition loans, of tuition, instead of 20, which imply they received about 3.4% lower than the equitable share. When you look at cumulatively, quintile 1 and 2, those are the upper quintals representing the lower income groups. They're receiving 37% of the tuition loans. But if you look closer, you'll find that between quintile 1 and quintile 2, we have a difference of 20, which imply that quintile 2 receive actually their fair share. And then from 3 progressing to 5, now we start to see that these groups receive higher, a little higher than their equitable share. For instance, if you look from the bottom up, from the bottom of our table going up, you'll be able to notice that quintals 4 and 5 cumulatively received 3 percentage points higher than their equitable share. And that tells us that the distribution of loans was actually in favor of the lower the higher income groups, that is represented by the quintile 4 and 5. It's important also to note at this point that our table varies from the last two we have seen on the composite and for the scholarships, because here, for the first time, we're now seeing the lower, the upper quintiles receiving lesser than their equitable share. We'll be able to explain later why that's not a big problem. So from what we are able to see here is that this distribution is regressive, though this does not mean that it's a bad thing, especially considering that loans are repayable. This distribution and loans being repayable will mean that beneficiaries have that burden, like burden of loan, and where the upper quintiles, the upper income groups receive lesser amount in loans, they have a lesser burden of the repayment liability, which is transferred to the higher income groups at the lower of the table. Turning to our chart on the right, that is the Lorenz curve, we again notice that in this chart, the Lorenz curve, the line in blue, is actually below the line of perfect equality. That's the orange line. The orange line here actually is a theoretical line of perfect equality. And here it's helping us to be able to compare between the actual distribution and what a perfect distribution would look like. And now from that chart 7 on our right, we're able to establish that there is inequality in the distribution of loans, actually towards favoring the higher income groups, that is mostly the quintile 4 and 5. Now, we are turning to the last item, that is the upkeep component. And as the first speaker explained to us, this is an amount that students receive strata for their daily living expenses, such as accommodation, stationery, and food. Now, for these 5 banks that were identified, the amount ranges from 40 to 60,000. The higher income groups, that's the band 5, students in band 5 received 40,000, and then we have an increase of 5,000 as you go up the bands, meaning we have 60,000 for students in band 1. This means that the students from lower income groups are being appropriated more amounts in upkeep, which actually reflects that the level of need was considered in this distribution, which tells us that the distribution was informed by equity. Keenly looking at our table 8, you will notice that is on our second column, that quintile 1 actually received 24% of the total share of upkeep, that's cumulatively, which is 4% higher than the equitable share of 20. If you look at the cumulative for the first 2 income quintile, they received 45% and not 45% of the total share, which is again 5 percentage points higher than the equitable share. On the other hand, the bottom 2, that is quintals 4 and 5, on cumulatively received 36% of the total share, meaning they lost about 4 percentage points of their equitable share. And this tells us that the distribution of upkeep was actually the equity consideration. Equity consideration dictated the distribution, whereby we find that the lower income groups that's on the top were appropriated more resources compared to the higher income groups at the bottom of the table. And here, then, we are able to confirm that the equity consideration was actually equity was the call in the distribution of upkeep. The increases of 5,000 from a band to another will require further interrogation, and maybe we'll have a separate discussion where we'll be able to try to find out why that arbitrary distribution actually, that difference. On our right, we have our Lorenz curve, and from the keen observation, this is different from the chart that focused on loans, so that is on tuition. Here we are able to see that the line of perfect equality, the orange line, which we said that's just a theoretical line that helps us to compare, to see how a perfect distribution would look like. And then our Lorenz curve, the line in blue, now shows the actual distribution. And here we're able to establish that now that it's above the line of perfect inequality, our finding is that the appropriation of upkeep favors students in the lower income groups, that's the upper bands. In other words, this is actually favoring the students in upper bands, and that's at the expense of students in higher income groups, that's 4 and 5 below. And therefore, the conclusion we are going to make here is that the means testing model, especially with focus on the upkeep, achieves equity in the distribution, and therefore this is a progressive distribution. Thank you, and I turn back to Jackie.
Thanks, Jairus. We go to the last part, Kwame.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks to my colleagues. I'm just going to talk about our conclusions. So we've had the presentation, and this presentation is, this study is divided into two parts. The first part talked about the adequacy. We are asking ourselves, based on the work that the results of the means testing instrument that was designed together by the Ministry of Education together with the Higher Education, or administered by the Higher Education Loans Board, what are the consequences for adequacy? And then on the other side, we ask ourselves, what are the equity considerations? Those have been the biggest questions being debated over this time around the new funding model. Now, I also need to remind us that the means testing model was only applied for the first time for the first class last year. So we only have results for the first 1 year, and that's what we're subjecting to this analysis. So we go to adequacy. I think it's very, very clear if you measure from the supply side. The supply side is the amount of money that goes through the fund and the loans provided by the Higher Education Loans Board. And it's telling us that if you look at the total amount that is displayed, that is distributed to students under whatever heads, whether it's a loan and all that, it's telling you that it's been rising as a share of GDP. It's been rising as a share of total government of Kenya spending over the 10 years that we considered from 2014 all the way to last year. To the financial year that started in 2023 in July. Inflation, GOK spending as a share of tax revenues and as a share of total government of Kenya spending. So what that means is the supply of resources measured in both nominal and real terms has been growing. Whether you cut it by its share of GDP, cut it by its total government spending, by tax revenues, and total public sector spending. So we've seen that. And total education sector spending. So that's an important thing. The other thing is then, what's the inflation effect on the value of the fund that is distributed has been reduced. So basically, when you compare what the average scholarship or the average subsidy has been in terms of the entire amount that is spent distributed by the number of students. So here we are matching both the demand and the supply side. The value has been reducing. The value per student has been reducing when measured as a share. When measured in 2014 terms. Asking ourselves, the average income, or the average subsidy in 2014 was 36,000. Is taking account of inflation in 2000 in the subsequent years, is that amount of buying power per student being maintained? And we could see that it was eroded by quite some amount, actually substantially. So that's basically a second thing. So what means that the inflation effect on the average funding, especially the loan side, needs to be considered because inflation has had an effect. And if you look at it, inflation is eroding. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if the value of providing that education is falling. But we're not seeing evidence that it's been falling, which means that the Higher Education Loans Board is constrained and therefore giving a smaller share to every student over that period, because the number of students that's coming in is higher. It requires, therefore, that inflation indexing should happen. And this inflation indexing means that in providing the grant and providing the funding, on the allocation side, Parliament, the Ministry of Education should consider indexing that grant to inflation so that it meets the effect of that inflation erosion over time. And then the final part on the adequacy side, we need to remember that the Higher Education Loans Board manages a fund. So what that means is that an actuarial balance, which is basically how much the fund is able to sustain itself, and its fairness in terms of how it deals with those who are recipients of the fund, is something that needs to be borne into account, and that the study will complete. Then we go to the equity side, which is what has raised most of the conversations. In our view, the distribution seems to be consistent with our equity as a goal. For the first cohort of students in 2023, so the 122,000 students that we divided into 5 equal income groups. So basically what we did was we asked ourselves, what income group does a student represent? And we split all of them into quintiles, and then asked ourselves, now that they have received the grant, what share of money is allocated to every student? And we divided it by upkeep, by scholarship, and of course by the tuition itself. And it seems to be equitable. in the sense that the lower income groups seems to be getting a greater part of the benefit. We'll come to the part on scholarships. We think the scholarships, which is the bigger part, and remember, scholarships is government actually just giving a subsidy which is not paid for, which is not refunded and given to every student. It is 48% of the total spending in education, tertiary education. And it is forgiven. So basically, it's government giving a gift for somebody having passed an exam, and therefore is going to a tertiary education institution, mostly a university. We think it should be reconsidered because it is 48% of the part. It is being given to students who, in the first place, yes, have qualified for tertiary education. But if you look at the means testing instrument, which we showed here, most of the students going to education, tertiary education in Kenya, represent the fourth and fifth largest fifth richest society, people in Kenya's society. And that also reflects the people who actually completed secondary education. And secondary education access in Kenya is clearly not equitable. And for that reason, those who are ending up as people in the higher income groups, appropriating most of the subsidy. So that's an important thing. So in our view, because they're already richer than other Kenyans, we're not saying they're rich people, they are richer than other Kenyans who don't get in. And at the same time, because education confers a premium, they're going to earn the highest incomes in society on account of university and tertiary education. We think that while the distribution among them is equitable, their distribution relative to the rest of society is unequal because you are firing up and providing an advantage for them when they're already richer than the rest of the population. For that reason, scholarships should be granted, but it should be reconfigured to bear a loan status, which means it should be refundable. Otherwise, you're driving income inequality, as my colleagues have mentioned. We think as well that in the assignment of the upkeep share of the loan, it's very arbitrary because it starts from 40,000 and each additional income band, not our acquaintance, income band gets an additional 5,000. And that looks to us like a very arbitrary assignment. So perhaps the Higher Education Loans Board and the Ministry of Education should think about how that part of the income is how that part of the design is. Why an additional 5,000 shillings? So if they're going to use data, then it is possible to use data to frame it in a way that is actually more realistic. Using data from the National Bureau of Statistics or others, they can actually calculate fairly easily what the average should be. And then the final one is that, yes, we all know, if you look at it, and some of the questions that we might receive might be related to it, many people don't understand or don't seem to agree that the distribution of the funds available for the first year are consistent with an equity goal. Because many people seem to say, for instance, that person X coming from county X is the daughter or son of a cobbler or a bicycle repairman or a mechanic, a car mechanic, and how can they be expected to pay this share of fees? We are cautious about this for two reasons. One, it looks like the Ministry of Education, the Higher Education Loans Board, and the Universities Fund have not taken time to exactly explain how the MTI was applied and what its consequences is, because the MTI is a theoretical thing about where Kenyans, the means testing instrument is where Kenyans fall, but how it is applied and what are its effects in terms of making sure that access is available. So yes, some payments might be made, but because Kenyans are already a poorer society, those who are in the fourth and fifth largest are themselves in need of assistance. But when you see how that has been distributed for those who have come into into tertiary education, it has been fairly equitable. So the transparency about how it is applied is something that we think, including the real numbers, not necessarily disclosures of people, but if you really disclose those numbers, it'll get public confidence that the problem here does not seem to be equitable distribution, it seems to be the adequacy of the funding. And that is not a question or a problem that the Higher Education Loans Board can solve on its own. It's actually a question for Parliament and the Ministry of Education. And then finally, I think the biggest equity question in tertiary education in Kenya is a reflection of the fact that Kenya's education sector, which tends to be, like a referral system. You can only go to secondary school if you've been to primary school, and you can only go to university if you've gone to secondary school or high school and qualified to go to university. If there are inequities in access to primary school, and post-primary education in Kenya is one of the biggest problems in Kenya's education sector. And then retention in primary schools, in the high schools, are also a difficult one, so that those who complete, while they're still poor, reflect the highest income levels, where band 4 and 5, which are the richest Kenyans, are actually the ones who are represented in having qualified. Then the Higher Education Loans Board is already leading with a pre-selected group of people who have benefited, and I use the word benefited, or have transcended or overcome inadequate, the problems of access. So they tend to be the richer ones. So you cannot fix that problem at university level. If we want an equitable university or tertiary education system, we have to fix post-secondary, post-primary school education, and then talk about the question of adequacy and equity at that level. But when you assess for this first year of application of the means testing instrument, it shows us that there seems to be more equity. On the scholarship side, we've mentioned why we are concerned, because the scholarship side takes 48% of total government spending in tertiary education, and yet it is a free or non-refundable. It is affecting two things. It's affecting income inequality in the future, but it is also affecting the stability and actuarial fairness of the fund, because it's depleting the fund. We think those two should be reformed. Thank you.
All right. So thanks, everyone. We'll go now to the plenary session. I had asked earlier that if anyone had any questions. I'm trying to look into the chat box. I'll not try to recap because I think the conclusions have done that. So I'll just go open this up for plenary. There have been a lot of debate around this, and I'm sure some of you have some comments that you'd like to make. Let me see if anyone has any questions. Please raise your hand and I'll be able to, I'll invite you to speak. Just as you can reactivate the speaking, the mics. Thank you. So does anyone have a question that you'd like to ask our speakers? Please raise your hand, or if you have a comment, some thoughts that you'd like to share, please raise your hand. So I see one, is that a hand that went up and down? Yes, Abigail. Abigail, I see a hand up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Abigail Lumati, and I only have a question and clarification. I want to be clarified something. I did not understand the need for the bands to be changed. I would just like to understand why we settled on creating our own quantiles instead of just settling on the bands. Kindly clarify that for me. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Abigail. Anyone else? Before I invite the responses. Okay, so I think as the rest of you prepare some yourselves to ask questions, maybe we can start with Abigail's question. Winnie, you can go first because you spoke about the methodology.
Okay, thank you, Abigail, for your question. Yeah, like I mentioned, for the Higher Education Loans Board, the bands do not comprise a similar number of students, as in the number of students per band is not equal. But when we are arguing for the equity question, we are making an assumption, and that's why we clustered. So we are reclustering and assuming that what if these students, each band or each cluster had the same number of students. So the reclustering was just for purposes of our analysis and for arguing using the Lorenz curve. And I mean, Kwame will also speak to this, just for purposes of arguing for equality. So we are saying, let us have each cluster having the same number of students, as opposed to what HELP has, which has different number of students per band. I don't know if that answers your question, Abigail.
Yes, it actually does. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's just part of our methodology. Kwame, do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I'd like to say something. Could you please open the MFI the means testing instrument. I think, Abigail, that's an important question, and we need to tell you why. It's, yes, here. So let's leave it here. Now, if you look at this slide number 6, the university funding model, the Ministry of Education, together with the Higher Education Loans Board, classified students into 6 different parts. The 6th, the ones on the extreme right, would be receiving 0 GOK financing. So for the purposes of assigning benefit incidence, which is to find out which income group is receiving what, it's not essential. So there are actually 5 for the purposes of seeing who's receiving, because you see they receive no scholarship, they receive no loan, and their household provides 100% of that income. So we have 5 groups. Why we have these 5 groups of people, the number of students who are admitted to universities are not split into equal parts in these 5 groups. Please understand that. As a matter of fact, band 4 and 5 have, as you can see, band 4 and 5 represents 41% of the students. Band 3 is another 18. So if you look at it, they do not fall into equal groups among this. So what we did was to ask ourselves, for the students who were successful, regardless of their income group, we reclassify them among the richest to the poor for those students, not reflecting the Kenyan population, reflecting those students' income bands, because they're the ones who are available in. So we reclassified these. And what we asked ourselves, the Higher Education Loans Board provided for each income group, what was the average income? And then we lined up all those students from the richest to the poor for the 121 and split them into 5 different groups, which we called clusters. And they are the quintiles. Why? Because if you're going to do benefit incidence, you need to divide people into the income groups for those who have received the benefits, right? Into equal income groups. So we could have done 10, but we chose 5 for that. So what that means is you can do benefit incidence by looking at how much they appropriated from the funds on account of where they fall. So the income groups represented by university students are not a mirror of the Kenyan income group, but they represent income groups for students who attended university and who received a grant last year. So that's why we do that. So in our view, every time you see a quintile, it represents the same number of 22,000 students relative to all the other students. So the poorest all the way down to student number 122, who comes from the richest income group 4, the portion of the Kenyan population who were admitted to public universities last year. So that's an important clarification to make. Otherwise, we'd not be able to assign benefit incidence for equal income groups in order to be able to draw the Lorentz curves. I hope that's clear. Thanks.
Let's see if anyone else, does anyone else have a question? Please raise your hand or comment. Some thoughts you'd like to share with us, your experience, or if there's anything about the presentation that you'd also like to get some clarification. Yes, Faisal, I see your hand is up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Faisal?
Okay, so first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for the presentation. It's insightful, but I've got a question on the sustainability of the funding. Because, okay, it's only 1 year since it has been launched, but can specifically Kwame, can you explain how sustainable the funding model is, depending on, like, we've seen that the demand side is actually going to increase. From the look of the graph, is like it's going to increase. Will it be sustainable for the coming years, or there is likely more likely that this model won't sustain the students? Like, because for example, right now most students are going to the government universities in a way that most of them will be demanding for funds from the government. Now, will it be sustainable, or will it have to be changed every year so that it can cater for the students that are entering the universities?
Thank you. Thanks, Faisal. I think that's clear. Anyone else would like to also ask a question? Abigail, is your hand up again, or is this a mistake?
Yes, my hand is up.
Okay, please go ahead.
Another question I had was I wanted to ask now, having learnt all that we have, if you were to be placed in a corner, is that to say that we should stick with the previous funding method, or now what? What do we do? Should this be scrapped? Should it be readjusted? Like, and if it's to be adjusted, what are the necessary changes to be made? Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Abigail. I think the presenters have had that. So in addition to what they pointed to as the scholarship side having some being inherently problematic, maybe they can clarify, because I think your question ties to the sustainability question that has just been asked by Faisal. So we'll get a response. Anyone else? Before I allow the speakers to respond, would anyone else like to add some thoughts or ask a question? Okay, so we can get some responses. Kwame, the first question was asked to you directly, so maybe you can respond.
All right. To answer the question about sustainability of the funding, Winnie, can we go to the adequacy part, and especially the supply side? Yes, here. No, the part before. Yes, the supply side. The one before this. The slide before this. No, the very first supply side. So yes, here. So you're asking me, Faisal, what's the sustainability of the funding? Now, that's two things we'll determine, but let's just go fast. If you look at this slide on table 1, you've seen that over the last, is it 11 or 12 years, the government of Kenya has raised spending on tertiary education, especially the loan side, from 0.09% of GDP to 0.21% of GDP. So if that is anything, it's telling us that the intent is there and it's rising, right? It's rising from 0.09% of GDP in 2014 all the way to 0.21%. That's big. As a share of GOK spending, you can also see from the fourth column, it came from 0.31 to 0.87, telling us, as Winnie said, that for every 100 shillings spent in 2023, the government of Kenya, of total government spending, 87 cents, right? Just closer to a shilling was spent on loan funding awarded through the Higher Education Loans Board. And then in 2014, it was at 31 cents. So it means it's improved even as a share of government spending 3 times, as a share of spending, remember. And then as a share of education spending, it used to be 1.8%, 1.87%. It's now about 5.1 and 5.09. So basically what that already telling you is the demand, the supply is rising, but the supply and demand have to meet for you to be able to answer that question of sustainability, right? If you go to the supply side, it was telling us that yes, while you're spending the same amount in the next slide, but it's okay. One of the things we've determined is that while you're spending the same amount, inflation is eating up how much money is being dedicated to the supply side, which is loans. You can see it was 5 billion in 2014. It's 33 billion in 2024. I mean, 2023-24. But if you adjust for inflation, it's just grown up 3.8%, but the number of students has gone up almost 7 times, from 112,000 to about 600,000 last year. So obviously it means that the resources being dedicated are rising, but they're not rising as fast as demand. But dedication to the resources is increasing. And what that usually tells you, if you're a basic student of economics, as I am, and as most of my colleagues is, because there are other competing demands for government, the escalation of the spending on free education, on funding tertiary education, is not going to rise this quickly anymore, unless some very big cuts are made somewhere else. So that's one of the things that we need to know. So definitely the efficiency of the spending is going to be essential, but more importantly, how you distribute it across the groups. And then we come to the demand side. On the demand side, you can see that the average loan per student is actually not meeting the buying power of 2014. So it looks like while the amount being dedicated is improving, but because the demand is growing at a far faster rate, what the Higher Education Loans Board seems to be doing is to allocate a smaller share to every student in order to distribute it among many more people. So there's the pressure, both in terms of numbers, and there's the pressure both by inflation. So that requires very, very solid and prudent management here. As you can see from this chart on table 4, you can see that the buying power of an average loan in real term, in real terms was 36,530 in 2014, right? 36,053 in 2014. And basically it needs by 2023, you need 64,000 shillings in 2023 money to buy the equivalent of 36,000 in 2014, showing you that there's about a change of 8,000 shillings per student between the average loan in 2014 and 2024. So that's partly pressure from inflation, largely pressure from inflation, but also driven by the number of students in terms of the demand for it. So if you put those two together, the sustainability of the funding becomes a challenge. Why? Because demand is going to grow. We know inflation is going to grow. How much government is dedicating to education is going to grow. But we think that given the pressures that exist, especially now when government has a crunch, it means certain things have to happen. The component of loans that is given as a grant, which is basically that tuition, has to change. The Higher Education Loans Board needs to be able not only to depend on government spending, but also to be able to recover more of that loan. And you are only going to recover more of the funding if you provide fewer grants, which is non-refundable. And we are concerned that 48% of the money is being provided to every university, to university students, especially those you get, without a funding or a recovery component. So the recovery part actually needs to be strengthened, which means the quotient or the component of grants has to be reduced substantially to make sure that the fund balances, which is what we're calling actuarial balance. Because if you're giving 48% of all money coming in out, and you're not recovering it by giving it as a gift, fine, we might have reason to fund university students, but if you want these funds to be balanced, definitely a greater portion of that needs to be recovered. So that's the first one. The second one is the inequality that is being caused. People who go into higher tertiary education in Kenya tend to represent disproportionately the fourth and biggest bands, the richest share of the Kenyan population, right? It's not rich people necessarily, but it's the richest share of the Kenyan population. So what that means is you're distributing income from lower income people, which everybody is paying for, and you're giving it to people who are already richer. And then you're going to escalate income inequalities because there's a premium related to tertiary education in Kenya. Those who have tertiary education earn something like 40% more per year than other people who haven't had university education. So because you're already investing in their future education, it is only fairer that they pay a bigger part of the components that is given to them as loans today. So that rejigging has to come. Otherwise, the fund might crash. Yeah, sorry for that, Stan. Thanks.
Okay, so I don't want to close in case Chantal, Vivian, Jairus, do you have any additional thoughts? Winnie, to what Kwame has said, responding to both Faisal and Abigail. Would any of you like to add something? Okay, I assume not. So I see one last question by Noel. Just a question, why did you guys settle on on that particular methodology, especially in the equity question? Are there any other methodologies that could have been used? So as they prepare to respond to that, I'd like to give an opportunity for any final questions, comments, anyone who'd like something clarified. Okay. Let me see, you can raise your hand. None? Okay. So because I don't see any hands up, I think we can get the response to Noel's question as we make our closing remarks. Because I don't see anyone else, I don't see any other questions on the chat box. I'll ask who we can start with Jairus in this case, and then we'll come to Vivian, and then Chantal, and then Winnie, and close with Kwame. So your closing remarks, anything that you'd like for our participants to take away, and if you're able to respond to that question by Noel, you can share your thoughts. So let's start with you, Jairus.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you for this opportunity. I'll just make 2 points before others come in on the last question, because on the methodology we prepared on this issue of equity, mostly we were looking at, mostly our question is on the cost of education and the available resources. And the biggest threat to the amounts that are allocated for funding education, as we have explained here, there are many other issues, but one of the key one was inflation, and that's why our methodology was informed the way it is. Finally, this is what I would like to see as my conclusion. We have noticed that even the real value of the loans, I'll talk first about loans. The real value of loans, if we base if I take our base year of 2014-15, you see that the real value is actually falling, which means that even the loans that we are providing today have a lower purchasing power compared to that time. And I think this is an issue now that should be considered during the allocation of loans. Finally, our conclusions, I think we have strong conclusions. And again, we are saying there's need for more transparency for the MTI, including just the categorization of students. And then finally, again, I'll just go back to that scholarship issue, because as money that will not be refunded is actually a threat to the sustainability of the fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jairus. Vivian, your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. So, yeah, this was really insightful, and I thank my colleagues. Kwame has really elaborated it well, and I believe for our participants who have learned something. So my closing remark, I'll just say that the education market is basically a two-sided market, and we have the demand and the supply side. And from our analysis, we have seen that the demand is really growing, even more than the supply. So it speaks so much, and that implies that there should be an increase in supply, especially for the funds that are allocated towards education, so that it can match the demand. Yeah, thank you very much, and yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Vivian. We go to Chantal. Closing remarks. Chantal?
Thank you. For my closing remarks, I don't have a lot to say, but in conclusion, while the scholarship component of the funding model effectively supports lower income students by providing them with a larger share of the non-repayable funds, it also raises important equity concerns that we have gone through. This progressive design does ensure that those from lower income households benefit disproportionately, and ease their future repayment burdens, which is really a good thing when you think about it. However, the redistribution, when you think about it for the whole Kenyan population, um, the redistribution of public funds to relatively wealthier students, enabling them with access to premium education, may inadvertently exacerbate inequality. But that's if we keep the scholarships non-repayable, the model could contribute to future income disparities linked to unequal access to higher education. All in all, striking a balance between equity, fairness, and long-term sustainability remains critical if we wanted this funding model to not only thrive, but just be, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Chantal. Before Winnie, I see there's a late question here by John Mutua, who's asking, is it correct to conclude that given that spending on post-secondary education is regressive, disproportionately benefits the middle and higher income households, therefore the scholarship component should be reduced and the loan repayment and recovery efforts should be enhanced? I think that's what they've been trying to say, but I'll welcome the last two speakers to comment on John's, give a response to John as you make your concluding remarks. So Winnie.
All right, thank you, Jackie, and thank you, everyone. So just to respond to the two last questions. So in terms of our methodology, we are cognizant of the fact that there are other factors that affect price change. But in our case, but the major factor is usually inflation. So that is why for our case, in arguing for adequacy, we chose to work with inflation. And then remember, you cannot you cannot be in a position where you're comparing nominal figures or nominal values over a period of time. So for you to be able to compare those figures, then what you need to do is to be able to get the real term values for the nominal figures. And that is why we then proceeded to construct a deflator. And in constructing that deflator, we are then able to distinguish between the nominal values and the real value. So when we are making our argument, we are making an argument from the real term values and not the nominal values, because the nominal values really tell us we can't derive much from the nominal values. So that speaks to our methodology. So yes, there are different other ways that would have been used, but for this specific analysis, we chose to go through and use the inflation aspect to argue for adequacy. And then of course, when we moved to the equity question, we wanted to argue for equity using the line of equality, which then allows us to redistribute, like we had earlier explained, and then see where the real the real values fall within the line of equality. So really, that was just a choice that we as the IEA actually made. And as for John, yes, if just going back to the conclusions that Kwame made, I think everything that you're saying is part of our conclusion, where we are saying, given that the scholarship value is really high, 48% of the fund going going in as a subsidy is a conversation we really need to have, and we really need to have it critically. Why? Because remember, inflation is already eroding the fund. So you can imagine, topped to what inflation is already doing to the fund, you are giving 48% of the total fund allocations away without having it repaid. So just having conversations in-house at the IEA, then we are saying, why not reconsider and have the higher percentage going in as loans and the lower percentage going in as subsidy, if we must insist on having that subsidy. And then somebody had asked which way forward for this conversation. Really, this analysis shows us that there are certain areas within the implementation of the MTI that are actually good. We have we have a progressive side and the regressive side. So what we need to do is sit back and look at this regressive side and ask ourselves, what can we do about the regressive side? What we are saying is this MTI has both, its application has both positives and has negatives. And I hear you when you ask, so what we need to be looking at is how do we strengthen the positives, and then the negatives that exist, which are evident, then how do we sit back and address those the negatives. And in my closing remarks, it's just to inform us that this is just a paper that we are working on, and once the paper will be out, you will be reading through and reading through three parts: the adequacy question, the equity question, and of course the sustainability of the fund, which is a big question that needs to be responded to. And given a previous simulation, which we will attach as we'll be sharing this presentation, it was very clear that inflation is even eroding the recovered amounts, because as much as health is really trying to push itself to recover and hit its recovery targets, instances where they have recovered, if you look at it in nominal terms, they will argue that they're actually meeting their targets. But if you argue for it in real terms, then you notice that they're actually not meeting their targets. So still, inflation is eroding the fund, and then the fact that they're not recovering real terms and they're recovering sometimes lower than their targets, again, that still jeopardizes the sustainability of the fund. So Jackie, that's it for me. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Winnie. So we go to Kwame, your final remarks.
Right. Noel asked why did we use methodology for equity? I mean, to assess equity. That's a standard methodology in economics. If you know another one that you think we should apply, we would be glad to apply it. But we look around clearly, and also because the main questions that people have asked in Kenya around the fund on the equity side is why are richer students, or rather, why are students coming from poor families not receiving adequate funding? And I think that's a question of adequacy. On the question of equity is for the fund that is available, and we know that the students who go to universities, especially in tertiary education in particular in Kenya, tend to come from income groups that are the higher income groups. So if you take them already, ask yourself, regardless of whether they are the highest, what's the relative household income, and then you line that up against each other. You are able to draw quintiles and then talk about the distribution across those quintiles, because in the end, the funding goes to an individual. It doesn't go to an income group. But you want to find out which income group this student comes from. And that's what this Lorenz curve gives perfectly, enables you to. Even globally, even in the country, we calculate a Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient tells you how you distribute a certain resource. And it might be income, it might be anything other benefit across an income group, with a Gini of 0 telling you 0 inequality, and 1 telling you perfect inequality, where the highest income person takes all the income. So it's an accepted methodology, and I think it's standard, and it's very good for illustrative purposes, but also because it has significant. Once you understand it, it gives you a good way to put it into policy about what needs to be fixed. So I hope that helps. John, yes, and that's what our conclusions, if you look at our conclusions page, that's what we are saying, that because the bigger part of the subsidy the government provides is on education, I mean on scholarship, and that scholarship is completely forgiven, in the sense that it's actually given as a grant, which students appropriate, and they appropriate it without having to pay for it. They only pay for the upkeep and the other loans that they get. Then that part ought to be redistributed, not to just be redistributed. It needs to consider what its external effects on inequality would be. First, the effect on the sustainability of the fund, because as a fund, it means it needs to be revolving. So it means to get enough money to fund future needs. But if you're giving 48% of it away to people who, as we've demonstrated, come from the highest income groups in Kenya, then you're actually creating further inequality, or redistributing from poor people to, it's a regressive distribution. Even if within the class, the group of people themselves, it tends to respect those differences in income. So yes, you're right. That component needs to be reduced, in our view, systematically, and in our view, in say 5 years, it should actually be entirely part of a loan. Why? Because people who go to universities in Kenya, The last census shows that only 3.5% of the Kenyan population had university education, for instance. That's a very highly elite class. They should not get public education for free. They should be funded, certainly, for access, but because they're going to get the best jobs and have a premium in income, they should be able to reservice that loan. Why? To ensure that it's the revolving fund is sustained, but also at the same time to ensure that you're dealing with this equity question finally. And Abigail, what is to be adjusted? I think the adjustments are partly what I've discussed now, but also spoken about it in our conclusions page. So thank you very much.
All right. So that said, I think we've now come to the end of this webinar. We thank you all for being here, for staying to the end of this, and we hope that this discussion has been helpful and insightful. Michelle, my colleague, has already shared the link to the presentation, but the fact sheets, the paper that the first analysis is also available, and I believe will be available on our website shortly. So thanks again, everyone. The IEA is a membership institution. So for those of you who are not members and those who would like to join us, please get in touch with our communications team and they'll advise you on membership. Thank you to our presenters for preparing the presentation and for sharing it with you. And we wish you all a good afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.